This mother had demonstrated how she shook her baby to death. This episode involves a interesting scenario, and a pediatric coroner investigator by the name of Denise Berton and myself had interviewed a young lady who demonstrated to us how she shook her baby to death. And what's more intriguing, we ultimately had to prosecute this case, which led to the conviction of this young lady, 18 years old. Apparently we learned that she was in fact disheartened by the fact that her boyfriend was living around the corner with another young lady who in the fact he was having children with there as well.
Welcome to When Death Awaits, Episode 7. Today's episode is titled Non-Accidental Trauma, and then in parens, there's a little baby case you'll see. So today we do have an esteemed guest with us. We're going to be looking a little bit different. You, fortunately or unfortunately, don't get to see Chris on today's episode. I think there'll be a lot of people in Palm Springs not happy about that. But we'll try and bring it back next time. We've got a better option today. I want to introduce Denise Bertone, although you just told us there was an I before the E, until your father's English teacher in second grade decided to change it.
Have
I thrown you off already?
You threw me off already. His third grade teacher in Boyle Heights at Soda Street Elementary School told him he was going to be more American now.
Wow, amazing. And look at you now. She is a retired deputy coroner, and she investigated more than 2,500 pediatric deaths in her 15 years as a coroner investigator. She started her career as an ER nurse?
Yes, at LA County USC Medical Center, at Big County.
Amazing. So that really gave her the translation tools of how to speak to officers and then dealing with infant and dead bodies. She has a long history with Uncle Rich, and I'm going to let Uncle Rich round out the less formal intro, because this is really going to be a conversation today. Denise has a great case for us, and these two have, I can already just tell, incredible chemistry between themselves, and I'm excited to jump in. But Uncle Rich, please, what else can you tell us about Denise?
Well, I will just start off by talking about the fact that we're going to profile a case that both Denise and I, and having seen as much as we have over the years, it was sort of, and maybe I could just speak for myself, but for me it was unprecedented in terms of what basically transpired on this investigation. But that aside, during the course of my tenure at Sheriff's Homicide, I had the unfortunate distinction of having a number of baby death investigations myself. Even went so far as to went to a week-long symposium in Denver for baby death investigations. That aside, when I started doing these investigations, I always made it a point, even though she was invariably busy all the time, I'd call Denise up and I'd say, Denise, I have another baby death investigation. And lo and behold, regardless of what she was doing, she'd put everything down and she would accompany me to these investigations. And that's what led up to today's case, because if it wasn't for her, there wouldn't have been an amazing outcome associated with this case, by way of sharing what this particular mother had demonstrated to us. And I know Denise is going to go into the more specifics and the more technical aspects to this, but I would just say this much. The fact that we were able to get this demonstration by way of a doll that Denise carries with her all the time, that was unbelievable in and of itself. But then to see this, so we do have it captured on video, this young lady demonstrating to us what exactly she did that ultimately caused her death. But again, I go back to a number of investigations that involved baby death, and Denise could attest to much of what I'm talking about. But more than that is the fact that there's nothing more traumatic, in my estimation, than dealing with the death of a child. And we've seen this whether the child is 5, 6, 7 years old, all the way down to their infancy. And that's, to me, traumatizing at best. And last week we had that question, how do you deal with these issues? And the reality is that you just carry them with you. And this one certainly had that type of impact on me.
And before you kick it over, we should probably just give the disclaimer. We know the sensitivity of the topic of anything relating to infants. So, this for those audience members who may not be able to stomach, this episode's not for you. Again, the video that Uncle Rich referenced earlier is not an actual baby. So, we'll give a little bit of disclaimer, but it does illuminate a little bit of what the suspect described and the actions that she had undertook that led to the baby's injury. So, if you don't have the stomach for it, we will not hold it against you for not listening to us. But Denise is great. Denise, thank you so much for being with us here today. And we're gonna pass it on to you. Take us through that day.
Okay, thank you. Well, first I'd like to start off that when you go into these, you aren't going into it with an idea that you're going to find somebody guilty of doing a crime. You're just collecting the information. And I always say I got more people out of trouble than I ever got in trouble. Because for the most part, parents, there's nobody who wants to know what happened to that baby more than the parent. And if you approach the investigation as an interview and ask the parent, it's sit down with them and sit down and have a conversation. Not stand while they're sitting, but to sit and have a conversation with the family and to say, I need to collect as much information as I can so I can hand it off to the doctor who's going to do an exam. And we want to give you some answers for why this happened. And if you approach it that way, people, I am shocked. This is the worst day of their life. And they are very gracious and they let us into their home and they sit and talk with us. This case was a little bit different. This child was found unresponsive at home, resuscitated in a community emergency room, and transferred to a larger hospital, and dies in the intensive care unit 12 hours later. So we know that the child has bleeding in the brain and bleeding in the eyes. We know that because we go to the hospital and speak to the physician. And I will pass it on. Say how that comes about.
I appreciate it, Denise. Basically, and I'll lay the foundation in terms of what basically transpired, and I go back to what I was referencing in terms of the significance that Denise plays in these pediatric cases. First and foremost, I get a call to respond to a hospital. And while I'm responding, it's over at Long Beach, I'm responding to the hospital.
And this is what year?
2012. And I would just say to that, this particular video, and maybe Denise could provide additional information of the significance of it, was that it was the first time I had ever seen in all of my cases where somebody actually demonstrated what exactly they had actually did that resulted in this child's unfortunate passing. But that aside, so I'm going over to the hospital, and my immediate and instinctive tuition is to call Denise.
Which hospital is this?
Long Beach. And so I'm driving over. Denise, this is what I have. And at that point, she got there about the same time as I did. And during the course of that, she started doing her conducting her investigation, which was a whole heck of a lot more significant than what I do in terms of, they could give me all this information and I have to unfortunately then document it and then provide it to the DA's office. Denise, on the other hand, she has multiple parties that she has to be accountable to the doctors, to the district attorney's office, to the Department of Family and Children's Services. And I could go on, and I apologize to you, Denise, in terms of providing that information before you even did. But I understand her significant role in these types of cases. And
So said a little bit differently, you guys are doing a group project and Denise did all the work.
pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
As is the case with different projects.
Exactly. So that aside, we then, once Denise draws some level of medical conclusions, we then go over to the home where this child had lived. And maybe you could add something to that, because I found, unlike some of the previous cases where you find the house is disheveled, you have disarray, you have dysfunctionality, kids.
Well, do we want to go to the home first, or do we want to go to what Denise saw at the hospital? Because the hospital.
Please
was the first
do. Yeah,
stop,
Denise,
right?
go ahead and go tell us about the hospital.
So at the hospital. Likely blood in there.
And how long had the baby been at the hospital?
12 hours.
12 hours.
Now, there's lots of discussions about timelines, and remember, practicing medicine is an art. So there are some people who will give one timeline for how long it takes for that soft spot, for the brain to swell enough, or for that to happen so that you feel that soft spot. And there's a lot, even for shaken baby. Shaken baby syndrome has been in the news a lot. It was probably, this was a solid abusive head trauma case. And there have been some cases in the past where they haven't been such solid cases. So we'll just leave that for the experts. Typically, we don't really want to get into the mechanism of injury, because there's only two who know the mechanism of injury, the perpetrator and the victim. And in this case, the victim can't speak, and the perpetrator's probably not going to fully disclose, if they disclose at all. In this case, she did. So the doctor tells me the baby has multiple bleeds in the brain. Now, there's different types of bleeds you can get, and it gets very technical, but the bleed this baby has is subdural, which is indicative of trauma and inflicted injury. And the baby also has hemorrhaging in the eyes. The eye specialist has already looked at this baby and determined that the injury that he sees in the eyes is consistent with trauma that we typically say is a result of shaking and perhaps an impact.
Could you describe for, in like layman's terms, just like visibly, how does that look? Like, how does a hemorrhage in an eye, I'm trying to picture it in my head.
This is the problem. In a baby with abusive head trauma, roughly 1 out of 3 will have bruising on the outside of their head. Retinal hemorrhages are inside the globe, inside the eyeball, and the doctor looks at them with special equipment and sees how that it's serious retinal hemorrhages. A lot of this is open for interpretation. Just because you have a broken arm doesn't mean you have an inflicted injury, right? Just because you have a retinal hemorrhages, there's different types of them. But this is serious and consistent with that term, non-accidental trauma. And that's how the doctor writes it in the notes, and that's how doctors speak with law enforcement. I have an issue with non-accidental trauma. Let's call it what it is. It's an inflicted injury. I don't like the double speak because it's confusing.
Why is it described that way? Is it just someone way back in the day just decided to come up with that term in the medical field?
And because they've always done it that way?
Okay.
I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm just a nurse. But we do know we have something very suspicious. Now, from this point of view, I want to see as a coroner investigator, I need to get as much of this baby's medical background, because I need to give it to the doctor we need to rule out any possibility that a medical condition can mimic abuse. Okay? The last thing we ever want to do is put someone in prison that be responsible for having a hand in that when they're an innocent person. So I have a thought in my head about what's going on, but my investigation is geared toward proving myself wrong. I want to look at as many avenues as I can to see if it could have been something else. So what I see on the baby when I examine the baby is that there's some small bruises on the face, a small scratch on the face, but baby has short fingernails, so I don't know where that came from. The soft spot on the top of the head is full. But other than that, I don't see retinal hemorrhages because they're inside the eyeball. And I don't see the bleeding in the brain for obvious reasons. The belly, the tummy of the baby is distended and tympanic, meaning it's drum-like. It's full of fluid. Now, in this case, it's not full of blood from trauma, but the intestines are dying and giving off gases. So, in fact, we need to make sure that there's nothing going on, any disease process going on that could have created that. But in this case, it was part of the process of dying.
Yeah, and I go even one step further than that. After she conducts her medical evaluation and has a level of suspicion, then, and that's the primary reason why I so much appreciated Denise's presence during the course of these investigations, is that then I could start drawing some level of effort to see what we're going to do in the context of prosecuting a person who has in fact inflicted injury on a child. And again, whatever jargon they use to describe that type of injury, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter to me. The bottom line is, can I prevent this person from doing any harm to anyone else? And I think that's, and I know that's Denise's objective too, but she does it on a more of a scientific basis. I do it more on a more of a superficial basis based on the information that's provided. So in that way, you know, we definitely went back to the house, once we conducted that evaluation, went to the house. And again, maybe Denise, you could attest to this too. You didn't find any real concern there. I mean, she was being raised by her grandmother, but there was nothing, there was no unsanitary conditions and the like, right?
Can I tell you something about Uncle Rich?
Of course.
Hates cockroaches and bugs. I had it.
Oh, that's going to get us our raid sponsorship.
So we've gone to some really awful places. And this house is clean, well furnished, family squared away.
And where is this home?
Compton.
Okay.
Yes, the home is beautiful, and it's plenty of baby supplies, a nice crib. Mother has a private room she has a 1-year-old as well. And everything looks squared away in the home.
Yeah, and in that regards, that to some extent played large into, providing the district attorney that type of information may not necessarily alter their opinion about what happened, but it definitely does have an impact in terms of the conditions. So when we look at it cumulatively with injuries, the suspicion on my part, and then you look at a pristine home like what we saw, we can't incorporate that into the prosecutorial aspect of this. But that aside, I would just say this much. Once we've completed that examination, we took ample amount of photos. We then went over to the...
Well, sorry, who was living at the home? You said it was a grandmother, the mother, the 1-year-old, and that 2-month-old who unfortunately has passed. Anyone else? Was a father in the picture?
Father lives down the street, and mother tells... I don't know if I'm getting ahead of it. Mother's kind of splits her time. There's some chaotic situation going on there. She spends some time down the street with him and the kids. I don't know if he's the father of baby number 1, whereas our baby, we know that he is the parent of this child. And so there's some, it's not, she has the environment that's all squared away, but she's really grasping at that relationship with him and going back and forth, spending some time at grandma's house in the nice house. And I didn't go to father at baby's home.
No, I didn't go to either. Matter of fact, going from there, we went over to the station where the mother had voluntarily came to the station to talk to us. And I emphasized that during the course of this particular interview. a number of occasions, just for the purposes of the investigation, you are here voluntarily, because when we look at it, we have to look at it and say, is there a necessary element there to give or provide her with her constitutional rights by way of the Miranda warning? And we didn't do that. So that was one of the issues there. And again, I emphasized that during the course of this particular experience. Denise is there, I'm there, my partner is there, and then we conduct the interview. Now this is where the twist comes in. Denise, maybe you could tell us exactly what you did as far as that camera is concerned, because I thought that was amazing. That was the most contributing factor that played in this. More than that, is the fact that no one had ever seen that type of demonstration. As far, maybe you could clearly tell me that there were a lot of interest in terms of that video.
Well, before we get into that, there are people who are listening on Spotify, Apple, all your favorite podcast platforms. Hit like and subscribe. But if you want to actually see the visuals from the video and what Denise is going to be describing for us too, you can switch over to the When Death Awaits YouTube channel. We may also have some fun stuff on social, but you want to get the full experience. So now, please take it away.
Okay. We have a long interview. I have to start with a rapport with mom. And during that, I get medical history. There is a previous hospitalization for this child 2 weeks before. The baby had a choking episode, is taken to the hospital in the ICU for about 10 days, and is discharged home with anemia and reflux disease. The anemia, the baby's lost to follow-up, never gets follow-up. The anemia was likely from a previous shaking episode or a bleeding in the brain episode, and it's missed. So there's an opportunity for intervention that was missed because they didn't suspect abuse. And that's heartbreaking in this. Mother wouldn't have gone to prison, baby wouldn't have ended up dead.
So just reacting to that, what other causes could there be for anemia other than shaking baby syndrome that the doctors did they overlook it? You think someone maybe had just missed it?
This baby was, once again, I hate to use the term shaken baby syndrome, but in this case, this baby was diagnosed with anemia, just a little bit low, and the baby had been early term, but they say premature, and sometimes anemia is associated with premature birth. But this is an early term 5-pound baby, spent 2 weeks in the NICU. They never find a cause. And they didn't keep looking. Just like we have to ask the next uncomfortable question and the next uncomfortable question, medical providers are also responsible to vet every possible avenue that could have been the cause of anemia. And we typically, when I say anemia to most people, they go automatically to a medical problem, like they're not getting enough iron in their diet.
Right.
Anemia can also be caused from bleeding, and children are not small adults. They have great big heads and little bodies, and an adult cannot lose enough blood in their brain to make their blood count drop, but a baby can. And I would say that there were two fatal errors, and that is they didn't pursue the anemia and find the source of it, and baby was lost to follow-up, meaning they didn't have a way of making an appointment to discharge when they discharged her, so they told mother, who ends up being our perpetrator, to go to the doctor. So we want to get as much of that history, and then we get to...
She's giving you this history at the police station voluntarily.
Yes, and I don't need to Mirandize. I'm doing a death investigation.
Yeah.
Just like when I'm in a house where somebody has died, I can look through the cupboards. The law doesn't say that, because I'm looking for causes of death. I'm looking for drugs or something that could have contributed to the death. So the rules are different for me.
Well, this is the law nerd in me, but when you went to the house, did you guys need a warrant to go, or...
No, that's the beauty of having Denise Berton there. Is that we
need to keep your phone number on speed dial.
Yeah, nice to know I was there just to get a pass to get in the house.
I could have easily written a search warrant, but I also was looking for the source if Denise could find a source. And again, I go to Denise's expertise and her education and experience, and it's amazing what she sees that I don't. That, to me, speaks volumes about her expertise in terms of the ability to see something and say, aha, that conceivably could have contributed. Whereas I'm looking at this, as a piece of paper, she's looking at this as a potential contributory factor.
Got it.
So
Nice.
anyways.
So we start getting into the story, and baby has small bruises on the face. I want to know what they're caused from. So in talking to the mother, I ask if baby's ever been injured, and it's the 1-year-old sibling. And mother initially says the sibling threw a bottle at the baby or a pacifier at the baby, and that's what caused the bruise. And then as we work through some of this, she starts disclosing more. And it's a lot of times people don't tell us the truth, especially in baby deaths, because they don't want us to think they're a bad parent. And I have no doubt that this mother loves her baby on some level. And that was very evident. But we start talking about what happened. And we learned that she had just had a disagreement with the father of the baby. And she then talks about that she did shake the baby.
And what's her demeanor as she's describing this to you? Is she shaken? I mean, her baby's just passed away not too long ago.
She's not crying. No runny nose, no crying. Very almost defeated. She's just talking and unloading her conscience, I would say. Yeah. What did you think?
I would characterize it that way, almost on a level of indifference, primarily because she realizes she's in a setting where we're scrutinizing what has just transpired. So in that regard, there is an element, slight element of defense, but yet I think Denise just hit it on the head there in terms of realizing that she's resigned herself to what has just happened.
Yeah, and everyone, I'm sure, everyone grieves differently and has different reactions and whatnot, but you guys were there in the room.
Yeah, I could attest to that.
Yeah, and you have to be very careful about gauging someone's grief reaction. It's culturally, we don't know what's going on with it. So she does disclose that she's shaken the baby. Now, what does shaking the baby mean? Like you toss a little kid's hair, like you put your hand on the baby's chest and shake him to wake him up, And this is pre-cell phone. Now everybody films everything. I had a little, pretty cheap camera, and it had a little movie dial on it. And I thought, well, what the heck? So I asked her to show me, and I give her my doll, and she's sitting down. In hindsight, I should have had her standing up when she did it. And we go through the CPR. It's helpful to know how somebody tried to do chest compressions because we don't want to blame an injury on somebody that happened during resuscitation, especially aggressive resuscitation efforts. So she does that, and then she starts shaking the doll.
Well, she said that she was. What was? Sorry if I missed it, but why was she shaking the doll? Or no, not the doll, but the baby in the
baby. So what happens is, the boyfriend had just told her he didn't want to see her anymore. She was frustrated. This baby was difficult, had a history of being difficult to console. Mom had never, remember this baby's in the NICU for 2 weeks. Tube feeding, so when baby comes home, it's really difficult to feed this baby. And it's taking her a long time to feed it. And this baby was not coming home into a relaxed, loving, nurturing environment. She is a young girl with a 1-year-old, a boyfriend. There's a lot of chaotic social factors going on. And remember, crying increases for all babies between the ages of 6 to 8 weeks. And crying is designed by nature to be an awful noise to our ear. Otherwise, we would never get our ass out of bed and go feed that baby in the middle of the night, right? So, crying sets her off, and the baby wants to eat. Boyfriend's kicked her to the curb. The baby's crying, and she says, "I'm making his bottle." And that's the key when we listen to that video. She says, or when I make his bottle. And she wants the baby, she thinks the baby should be sophisticated enough to know, baby's hungry and crying, I'm making the bottle, stop crying already. Just be patient, I'm doing it. And the baby won't stop crying. And she had, in the past, shaken the baby because it made the baby calm down and be quiet. So she picks up the doll and she shakes it. And I could see on his face across the table that he doesn't think I'm really getting this recorded. And I'm not so sure myself. So,
and clearly, and fortunate or unfortunately, I'm in the video. And clearly my facial features reflect something that I had never seen before. And the frustration and the anger.
Now, if we, for listeners, not the people who are watching, how violent was the shaking, or like, how would you describe it?
Well, it was relatively mild. However, and maybe you could attest to this, Denise, what she demonstrated versus what the actual injuries are. Tell me that. What?
They're worlds apart. So, as I mentioned, shaking babies is a dangerous topic. You would think if you're shaking a baby with a great big head so violently, you'd see neck injuries, and you don't, even microscopically. And again, there's the other discussion about, was there an impact? And if you're shaking a baby so violently, these children, the legs can hyperextend. So at the knees of the baby, they'll get little corner fractures. Think of when you're eating a chicken bone, how that cap comes off. That the legs hyperextend so much that it pulls that, and you'll see little fractures. So this is very, very violent. And obviously, no one's going to fully disclose that to us. And was there an impact? And is that impact on a hard surface? And then you would have a fracture? Or is it on a mattress? That mattress, you're not going to see a skull fracture. However, you still have the brain inside the skull hitting the inside of the skull, right? Mm-hmm. And then within the white matter and the gray matter and the different anatomy in the brain, they all have different weights. So they're also moving at different speeds when you have that whipping motion. So there's a lot of layers in the brain that are affected differently. So I would say she did not fully disclose. And I have her, when I realize what has happened, I have her stand up and do another video. And by then she's clued in that she's gotten herself into some trouble, and she really steps back from it. Did
she not realize, or did you sense that, like you said, the shaking was by visually like probably mild. We wouldn't describe it as violent, although a little goes a long way when it comes to a 2-month-old infant. Do you think she, as you guys were describing it to her, she was kind of gathering that that's why it would have happened, or she knows what she did, or this we're kind of getting now into a little bit of the investigation. I don't want to jump ahead, but I'm very curious about that piece.
That's an interesting question, and it has a whole heck of a lot of elements to it, in that when in fact she demonstrated to us, did she in some way provide us a confession? And I think I go back to what Denise was saying, which was that there was a level of resignation there. And so by demonstrating that to us, maybe in essence, because I can't, other than what she told us, I can't go into her psychologically, but I will say that I think there was a level of confession on that part, barring the fact that she didn't do it to the extent that what Denise just described as the injuries that are associated with it. So in essence, she showed it to us, she demonstrated to us, yet it wasn't to the extent that she actually did it. So I would say, to answer your question, I would say yes, this was a level of a confession, but like any other confession that I've obtained over the years, and again, I go to the gamut of cases that I've investigated, this is one of those cases where, yes, I did, but I didn't do it that bad, And so, that's a conclusion I would draw. What was your?
I asked her.
Okay.
Always, I ask the caretaker, or in this case, the mother, do you know why the baby died? Why do you think the baby died? And she said, I don't know. And I asked her, is it that you don't know, or are you hoping you don't know? And she stated, I hope I don't know. So, yes, she knew. And remember, the baby had been hospitalized 2 weeks before for a similar type event. And but the baby then it was not as severe. So the baby presented with symptoms of choking and gagging and having a problem during feeding. Well, that was because the baby was having problems with the bleeding in the brain that was controlling its ability to suck from a bottle and swallow. And that's why the baby gagged. So she had a warning and got a pass on that one. And and this time it was just more severe, or the baby was more medically fragile because of a previous injury. I'm not sure.
Wow. And I think maybe that's a good transition to, what transpired at trial. I'm sure the DA then.
Right. Anytime we have a case like this, and whereas, because again, I've handled a number of these investigations, but I so much appreciated this case by way of just Denise's involvement. And she's been involved in a number of other cases that we've had together. And thank you, by the way, Denise, for coming, and all those other ones as well. But let me just say this. Going back to the interview, shortly thereafter, the father of the child showed up to Compton Station, and we allowed them to talk to each other. And I'm not sure if there was any consoling, but it was more of a conversation. We did detain her at that point for the purposes of this case. And then ultimately, I wrote it up and documented all of the interviews, coupled with Denise's investigation and all those medical records. And that was the beauty of Denise, is that she actually has access to the medical records. I can't get those by way of HIPAA. I have to get a court order. She fortunately can get those. But more than that is that once had all of that reports compiled, then my objective was to go to the district attorney's office and file inflict corporal punishment upon a child causing death, which is Penal Code Section 273D. And at that point, the district attorney does in fact have a child abuse unit. And it's interesting because, and this is probably one of the things I've never done, is that I've never dealt with child abuse per se. The Sheriff's Department does have a child abuse unit. It's called the Special Victims Unit. And I'm completely just opposed to conducting those kind of investigations because of the heartfelt experience by dealing with kids that have been abused. But now I'm taking it a step further, and now I'm dealing with dead children. And that in and of itself is just, I guess that would be even, I don't know. And when you're looking at a child who's been abused sexually, physically, and so forth and so on, who are still alive looking at you saying, but yet you have a child you're looking at who's deceased, and you want to do something, be some advocate for that person, regardless of what the circumstances are. That aside, took it to the district attorney's office, and they filed based on everything cumulatively we provided for them. And we actually took it to the DA's office. And interestingly enough, this 18-year-old is now 19, and she's in custody, still in custody. But she looks, did you see her? She looked relatively prim and proper now. Amazingly, I would say, and I hate to use the term, but she cleaned up very well. And so we went in front of a jury, and the jury came back hung by way of the argument, if I remember correctly, was that she had no intention of killing her child.
Which would then be a involuntary manslaughter case, or what was the prosecution arguing, and what was the defense arguing?
The prosecution argued that this young lady had purposely shook this child to death and causing all of those injuries that Denise just described. The defense was that they didn't intend to do it. Now, if we want to get very technical and specific, depending on the jury instruction, that would ultimately determine if the jury can come to a lesser crime. But they couldn't even come to that conclusion. I think the jury came back with it was 9-3 for guilty. And so, anyways, going back to then that's. Did you need to say something, Denise? Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to explain. They always child abuse leading to the death of a child under 8 because murder has to show intent, although they have the same punishment. But nobody ever wants to think that somebody would do something so violent to a child. And we know now from the nanny cams and things like that these are unprovoked and prolonged vicious attacks. And then there are some times in the news where you hear about people being exonerated. The Glass case was one that went to the Supreme Court that it ended up that I reviewed that case, and it was a baby that was the grandmother was accused of abuse, and it ended up that the child had been abused, but the actual death was caused from an unsafe sleep environment. So we don't know who did the abuse. You see, there's a lot there is a lot in the news, and there's a lot of conspiracy people that say, but bottom line is we've seen it on camera about how violent people can be toward an infant.
Yeah, it's almost like you're doing 90% of the work, right? And 10% is probably not a direct result of an action you are taking that does the job, but it's like such a gray area in the law, I guess, to figure out.
Well, we don't ever want to think that somebody can be that much of a monster and then turn around and be such a normal person. I mean, she's a very pleasant gal to sit and talk to. I remember during the interview, I felt a little emotional. I felt for her. She was in a really when she's rejected by the boyfriend and she's frustrated and the child's crying and crying and crying and crying. But
that said, we ended up again filing the 273D, and which is the exposure on that is 25 to life. And so ultimately the jury came back hung. They went back to her defense team and they said, we'll give you 8 years if you want to take that. And ultimately she resigned herself and took the 8 years.
Because otherwise it would be a retrial because it was hung?
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. And I think there was a level of sympathy for her, both by way of the prosecutors and by way of the defense and the judge, and they accepted that plea bargain. So in essence, when it came down to there's no real winners here, especially when you have a young lady like that who's obviously going to suspend her life for 8 years. And it comes down to one thing and one thing only: what could we have done? And that's one of the things I want to explore here too. What could we have done to prevent this type of a situation from happening? And one of the things that I really kind of wanted to explore was when she got pregnant, she was 17 years old, and her boyfriend was 23. And I conducted an investigation. I said, wait a minute, maybe there's a potential child abuse here. Well, it turns out, yeah, there is, but because of the age difference, it's a misdemeanor here in the state of California. So the district attorney didn't even want to pursue that. So, but then again, that's just me. I want to pursue every avenue to try and have this type of preventative measures.
The other one I think of for preventative is what you described, how it seems like it was missed, right? The first time the baby went into the hospital. And are the procedures set with, the medical teams to alert law enforcement that, hey, this is a potential abuse case, check it out, or have a call, social services. I don't know whatever the mechanism is. I don't know if that exists, or that to me was another instance describing what Uncle Rich said.
It was a fumble on the part and devastating. What about taking it back to the fact that this is an 18-year-old girl by the time she has the baby with a 1-year-old and a newborn. She's discharged home from the birth hospital. when people, I ask friends and fellow coroner investigators when they have babies, what kind of safe sleep teaching? What did they teach you about crying? Safe sleep is not really touched upon. We lose more children in this country due to unsafe sleep environments than we do to murders. Wow. Or to non-accidental trauma. The other thing is teach parents about crying. You know, when you take a baby home from the hospital, everybody's thrilled and it's exciting. But are they going to teach them that at 6 to 8 weeks, this baby is going to cry more? And when you can't console this baby, you can make sure this baby is safe. And you know what? Take a step outside the house and walk in the backyard and just get yourself together for 2 minutes and then come back in and then try the things to console the baby again. But they don't teach people, new parents, about crying and that this is going to be very difficult at times. And you need to make a plan for what you're going to do when this baby cries and cries and cries and cries. And you're doing all you can and maybe getting criticism from your family because you're not consoling the baby properly. They view it, they blame, when there's a baby that cries a lot, they often blame the parent rather than this baby just happens to be one that colic is not an upset tummy. Colic is inconsolable crying. And to teach parents about that.
Yeah, good point. Well, so
thank you so much for joining us today.
I have one more thing.
Okay, great.
I have to say, because, and I don't think I've ever, but I worked with a lot of detectives all over the county. And he worked harder than anybody else.
You don't need to do that on this podcast.
I have not, like my kids always told me. You never gave us a lot of compliments, Mom, but when you did, we knew they were legit.
That's amazing. No, we have a great time working with them. Well, then I have to ask you this, and I don't want to mean to put you on the spot, but last week we had a Q&A session. We had someone in the audience ask if he, or maybe it was Chris's question, if there was an actor playing this guy in a movie, who would the actor be? I don't know if you have...
Right. I was working 70 to 80 hours a week. I wasn't watching much television. I'm not up on the actors.
Well, that's a good excuse. That's a pretty good excuse. Well, if you have an answer later and you see someone on a billboard,
I'll let you know.
That's amazing. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. This was amazing. We're going to hope to have you back for another one. And that is, I think, an episode wrap. Thank you, guys.
I appreciate it. Thank you.